Eat human.
Les humains à leur meilleur.
C'est tu apogeo.
ピーク人間
Hello again, beautiful people. I hope everyone is doing well. Since I can't ask how you're doing, I'll skip straight to myself. I'm getting loaded with vitamin D daily and chowing down on nose-to-tail meat like it's my job. I guess it kind of is my job. My pool and gym are back open and things are looking good from where I'm standing. I hope people listening can stay the same. Let's try to keep that attitude positive. I'm talking to my new pal, Dr. Phil Maffetone today, who's a super interesting guy with a long career doing amazing things. He first tried running his body on fat back in the 70s and has been one of the leaders in the world getting athletes fat adapted to achieve peak performance ever since. During his 2 decades in private practice and beyond, Dr. Maffetone has been a respected pioneer in the field of complementary medicine, bringing the latest advances to healthcare professionals around the world. He is an internationally recognized researcher, educator, clinician, and author in the field of nutrition, exercise and sports medicine, and biofeedback. He's worked with athletes in almost every sport at the highest levels, including professional and Olympic athletes. Dr. Maffetone's research has been reported in newspapers, magazines, and other media around the world, including Huffington Post, The Today Show, Men's Health, CNN, Reader's Digest, and The Atlantic magazine. He's also published over 20 books since 1980. I think I'm just going to stop with his achievements already and get on to a few quick announcements. We're finally officially launching the Sapien program for those who want to seriously improve their health with a physician-supervised program, our video series, and other written and visual materials. We also are offering personalized health coaching to guide you through and keep you accountable. If you're not ready for all that, you can grab our free Sapien food guide at sapien.org. Either way, go to sapien.org to learn more. And if you're already on the right track, you can join the Sapien Tribe to connect with us on a deeper level and get bonus content, extra resources, our private weekly Zoom meetings with Dr. Gary and others, and our private members area. This is all just getting going, and we're getting a lot of signups to the special limited time lifetime membership at a deep discount. Check it out now before we run out, and find out all about it at sapien.org. Otherwise, just share this podcast with a friend. Go back and listen to the great episodes all the way back to number 1. Review it on the podcast app or iTunes, and don't forget about nosetotail.org. We're shipping grass-finished meat out weekly from our small ranch in Texas. I've been eating the primal ground beef with all the organs mixed in a lot lately, and now regular ground beef tastes watered down. You gotta check it out. Well, that's it. So now it's time for my interview with Dr. Phil Maffetone, which I really enjoyed. We had such a good time. We went for over 2 hours and then recorded even more bonus content for the Sapien Tribe members at the end. So much great info in this one. Please enjoy. Okay, we're started now. We're live with Dr. Phil Maffetone. We kind of started getting into it, but I wanted to officially, start the podcast, introduce him, say hello. How are you doing today? Where are you?
Hi, Brian. It's great to be with you. I'm doing fine, thanks, and I hope you're doing well. I'm in Vermont, USA. It's beautiful here.
Well, that's great to hear. I'm in LA, going to get some sun right after this. I'm sure we'll get into some vitamin D talk, but we should just jump right in with the COVID stuff, lockdown, health, immune system. There's so much going on, but this discussion is going to be so much beyond the current virus, the current pandemic, because these pandemics come every couple of years. There's always viruses floating around. So this is not, if you're listening to this in the future, this is not, just about right now in 2020. It's about health and the immune system and how we respond to these and policies and the government and a million things. But let's talk about all this stuff.
Yeah, and we will have another infectious disease pandemic in the relatively near future, unless we make some significant changes now. And I'm not talking about spraying down our homes and the rest of the world with disinfectant. I'm talking about helping the population get healthy, because humans have always had these potential pandemics and have had pandemics. It's a very important thing. And also, we are in the midst of a much bigger, more serious pandemic that's higher in numbers and really affects our existence as humans. And I know you're going to want to talk about that as well.
And what is that, the Overfat pandemic? Because I read your article.
That is the Overfat pandemic. And we are seeing this problem, and it's been growing for the last 50 years, really. Looking back, we saw when it started and how it increased first in the Western world, in the developed countries, and now, not surprisingly, in the developing countries now, because, we in the West provided a lot of food aid to developing countries for years and years. Some of us remember those TV commercials. I don't want to age myself, but, in the 60s, they were saying, hey, for 10 cents a month, you could feed X number of people a month or whatever. And it sounded great, but they were sending them junk food. And it created a situation where these people in the developing world began developing the same chronic diseases that we in the West had been developing for many years. And so here we are today, and now the whole world is overfat, and it has a significant effect. It's the most serious problem, I think, humans have ever had as a species.
It is. And not all doctors and health and big healthcare outlets and whatever, the CDC, WHO, they don't recognize the overfatness as the problem. There's almost the opposite, even in America these days, where they're trying to say, oh, health at all sizes. You're beautiful because you're gigantic.
Exactly. We have a social phenomenon that is, it's not unlike the no pain, no gain thing, where kids are taught to play in pain and to be hurt. It's cool to be all bandaged up. They hear it from TV. Big Joe is tough. He plays hurt. And if you're 7 years old, you're going to think, hey, man, I want to be tough too. I want to be hurt. I want to be bandaged up. And it's really sad. It's very, very sad. As you say, the recognition or lack of it by many organizations, many governments certainly, is a big problem. And there are political reasons for that. And there are money reasons for that. And we could say that there are a lot of people making millions and millions and billions of dollars on sickness. And so do they want sickness to go away? Do they want everybody to be healthy? Lots of tough questions there, and even more difficult answers.
Well, yeah, they probably don't actively want to hurt people, but they will just say, oh, well, it's just about calories, or, oh, they justify it away, but it's obvious that they need to make money by selling all this.
Yeah, it's the justification. Man, we talked about getting off track, but we can get really off track at this point with this issue of, well, there's enough money to go around for everybody if we just, stop wasting it and resources as well, and blah, blah. But we have a serious problem. The bottom line is that countries, the health organizations like the World Health Organization and the CDC could step in and say, hey, we have a serious problem, and here's how we can get rid of it. Look how long it took the so-called officials to address the tobacco issue. I mean, it was the early 60s when the Surgeon General made this big announcement, tobacco's bad, we're going to make changes. And of course, they never did. And then decades later, they went through this whole lawsuit thing. And what ended up seemed to be success for the anti-tobacco people, but the tobacco companies are more wealthy today than ever, and there are more people smoking than ever. So you don't notice it as much in the U.S. because smoking is banned in so many areas, but there's a lot of tobacco use and
around the world,
even,
tons of use, and they just have diversified into other junk food companies.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, that was a big thing, and which is appropriate because we're talking about overfat, and if we look at the cause of the overfat pandemic, it brings us to sugar and refined carbohydrate, which turns to sugar when you eat it, and so that model of sugar and that model of tobacco as a company and as a detriment to the human body is actually very similar. I've been saying for years that sugar is the new tobacco, and it's unfortunate that it's not being recognized. And if we look at the big picture, we do see the political issues. We have these people in Washington, for example, and likewise in other countries, who are called lobbyists, and they meet the politicians, and they wine and dine them, and they say, "Hey, we're a sugar producing state, or we have this, and we don't want to reduce the income of junk food companies or whatever." And that's how it works. And it worked for the tobacco industry, and it still does. It's different today, but it's working for the junk food companies quite well. Even the federal guidelines for food include junk food. The government subsidizes junk food. Come on, who's in charge here? And I have an answer to that question. It's we're in charge. We are responsible for our health, and we have to dodge the bullets that are out there. But we ultimately are responsible for putting the food in our shopping cart, cooking it for ourselves or our families. And if we have a problem, if we're overfat, we can change that just, really literally in one day. Actually, in 2 meals, we can begin changing our metabolism from an overfat metabolism to a healthy metabolism.
Yeah, no, I believe in that. Start now. It can happen so quickly. Your metabolic markers can change. But the problem is we've been tricked. We have control of our own health. And I've managed to stay, relatively in shape my whole life. But I just always talk about, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, I was overfat. I was skinny fat. I was following the guidelines. I lost both my parents. Like, this is a big reason why I'm making this film is my parents followed the guidelines. So they thought they were doing the right thing. We were eating low fat. We were eating all the grains. We were cooking our own meals, and they just gradually got sicker and, got that abdominal obesity, the visceral fat each year until they succumbed to chronic disease.
Yeah, and it's really sad. And I got sucked into that, as did my parents. And I was lucky in that, when I was 20 or give or take, I started seeing what was going on in the world, but really the food supply, I grew up in the 60s, so, we didn't trust too many people. And it was pretty clear that the food supply was tainted. And then my personal health had been suffering. I was fed sugar water from the time I was born. So I was a sugar junkie. And suddenly I was at the crossroads. Do I go the way they want me to go and become diseased, become a diabetic and become just an unhealthy person? Or do I say, hey, wait a minute, this is not working. This way of eating is not working. And that's fortunately what I did. And it was really a struggle. It's not easy to get off sugar. Sugar is a powerfully addicting substance, not in technical terms from an addiction standpoint, but at some point soon, it meets the criteria for addiction. So at some point soon, sugar will be defined as an addicting substance. And it's tough to get off, and it's tough to make the changes, especially years ago when the natural foods movement began to catch on, and the manufacturers and the retailers, even the growers, were saying, hey, we got to jump on this bandwagon and play the game. And so you had, the all natural term on a package of junk food. It used to say no sugar added, and we would find out, oh, no sugar added meant the company who sells this product didn't add sugar, but the company they bought it from added sugar. So, and people hear these things, and it's like in the 50s when doctors were doing commercials saying, cigarettes are good for you, and if you have a sore throat, smoke menthols. People laugh at that stuff, but the same things are going on today, and people don't know it. They're a lot trickier, and they're a lot more subtle, but it's still happening.
Well, yeah, no added sugar, but it's made of refined grains and flour and fruit. And so it could be 30 grams of sugar in that thing, but you can say no added sugar.
Refined sugar, that half of which, in many people, that sugar turns to fat and goes into storage, number one. And number two, the rest of that sugar prevents the fat we have in storage from coming out to be burned for energy.
Yeah. And fructose too, in your liver, it just goes to your liver, and your liver has to process it.
Yeah, and we could really simplify things that, they make it complicated, and complication is a technique. in food science and in healthcare in general. But, with foods, they have, the studies show that high fructose corn syrup is bad. The studies show that all sugar is bad. You can look at specific studies where they used high fructose corn syrup, or studies that used sucrose, or studies that, used brown sugar or whatever. Who cares? Sugar is sugar. And artificial sweeteners are not exactly the same, but they're just as bad because they stimulate the taste buds, which tell the brain we're eating sugar, and our metabolism responds. So it's really simple. So we shouldn't make it complicated, because when people get confused, they kind of give up and they say, oh, it's too complicated, or they're in the store and they're trying to think, what did that guy say about this sugar and that sugar? And I don't know. I'm just going to buy the same old thing. That's what companies rely on. They hope that you buy the same old thing, and it's quite successful.
Well, it's really funny. Agave. I remember the past 10 years, people think they're so healthy. Like, oh, I'm eating agave. And I'm like, the Mexican Coke. Oh, yeah, Mexican Coke. It's so good because it has real cane sugar, not high fructose corn syrup. Yeah. It's just super funny how people fall for everything. And I fell for a ton of things. So
yeah. There was a period of time, maybe the 80s or so, when I had a number of people say to me, pure cane sugar is not bad for you because it has the B vitamins. So you can eat as much as you want and it won't bother you. Where does this stuff come from? I don't understand. I mean, I'm a clinician. I'm a scientist. I'm also a person who has common sense and a lot of experience. And that experience was not easy. It's, the things they did to us. And who knows, what they're going to end up doing to us toward the end. But I'm feeling as good today as I've ever felt in my life. And that's really the way it should be.
Yeah. And you're an older guy, not that you're old, because you still are acting and feeling young, but you're doing great.
I tell people I'm physiologically younger. I have a 43 plus year career, but I'm physiologically younger than someone who's chronologically my age. And so the chronological age is really irrelevant. It's how well do you function physiologically? And we're seeing a lot of people who are chronologically, say, 60 or 70, and they're physiologically 75 or 85. And that's really sad to see. And it's particularly sad because we know that is preventable in 99% of the cases.
Absolutely. Well, that's all the stuff we're going to get into. And even just this general message of waking up, not listening to these governing bodies that are necessarily have your best interests in mind, or they don't take the best advice because they're funded by lobbyists or big food companies, pharmaceuticals. Like, just that general message of, that's what this podcast is all about, right? Is letting people take health into their own hands. And
that's very important. And if you don't, it's okay to not, get on board with these issues of who's to blame and, is it the lobbyists? The government is subsidizing junk food. The World Health Organization doesn't recognize the overfat. Who cares? What's important is we care, hopefully, about ourselves, and we're going to do something. The light goes on and, hey, I'm tired of feeling this way. I want to be physiologically younger. Whatever I've done in the past has been done, but it's a new day and I can make a dramatic change today.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So what is overfat? Did you coin that term? You wrote a paper about
I've written a number of papers, and I wrote a book called The Overfat Pandemic, and I've been writing and lecturing and talking about overfat my whole career. I saw the word overfat, it was two words, overfat, in a scientific paper, I think when I first got into practice, and I said, this is a great term. Let's put the words together, one word, overfat, because what was becoming evident was people who were not overweight, but they had excess body fat. And as the years went by and we saw more and more research about body fat and about body mass index, BMI, and the whole obesity bandwagon, it became evident that BMI was not a good measure. weight is not a good measure. Everybody, we've had generations of scale users now. You get up in the morning, you go in the bathroom, you step on the scale, and you set your mood for the day. And if you're 2 pounds less, then you say, "Oh, I'm really happy. I guess what I'm doing is right." Well, that's not true. Or if you're 2 pounds more, you're depressed and you deprive yourself of food and nutrients. And then you hope the next morning you're back to that baseline weight or you're 2 pounds under, thinking you've lost fat, but you haven't. You've lost water, which is easy to do. And so we had all this misinformation about weight and obesity and the different categories of obesity. This whole idea of BMI, which, body mass index, is how researchers have been studying this problem of overweight and obesity. But the fact is, 40% or more of normal weight, non-obese people could have excess body fat. And the problem is excess body fat. It doesn't matter what you weigh. All these other numbers are really irrelevant, because excess body fat means your body fat cells are sick. They're impaired. And our body fat is very important. It's a very key component of our health. It's important for our metabolism, important for our immune system, for insulation, regulating temperature. It's important because it communicates with the organs and glands, our muscles. It communicates with the brain. It's part of us. It's not just
hormones,
a blob of fat sitting there. And so when those fat cells don't function well, we get a lot more impaired from the standpoint of our health and fitness.
Yeah, so 40% of supposedly normal weight people could be over fat. And I believe this. I feel like so many people walk around and think that they're in shape. They're like, "Oh, a dad bod. I have a dad bod." But that's not good. That's not healthy.
It's serious. And the newest paper on overfat I wrote with my professor, Paul Larson, is a correction of my earlier paper I did with some colleagues, where we showed that up to 76% of the world, and it was a range, it was 62 to 76% of the world was over fat. And it only took 2-3 years for me to say, hey, wait a minute, my numbers were way off, way conservative. And so I had this idea, I've got to correct this. So I had a paper called Revisiting the Overfat Pandemic, and Paul and I put this together, and it came out earlier this year. And what we showed is that over 80% of the world is over fat. And some of the studies that are referenced in there were studies that show that some populations were demonstrating that 42% of normal weight, non-obese people were over fat. That's astounding. I mean, I've been preaching this for my whole career. We can throw the scale out the window. We can eliminate this weight thing. There's few exceptions. And we can take this obesity and all the obesity categories and get rid of them. Who cares that we've got tons and tons of data? And if we're going to do a new study, what better way to do it than to use obesity, because we have all this other data and makes for a cute research paper that will be funded again. And that game is getting old, because we're getting misinformation, and it's affecting us. So that's an important factor.
Well, it's huge. So we have to define overfat better and how you even measure it, but also just the BMI. I mean, most people know that BMI is wrong and not accurate because they know a bodybuilder, like someone who carries a lot of muscle, could have a really high BMI, but they could not have a high fat percentage.
Sure, and they've known that for a long time. And once in a while, you'll read in a research paper, this doesn't apply to big football players or whatever. But it's way beyond that. It's just think of that 42% of the people who don't fit the model. What do we do with them? And then there's all these other people who have other issues. So the system doesn't work. And if it doesn't work, let's get rid of it. I've gotten rid of it. So overfat, like I was saying earlier, I started using it in the beginning of my career, and it actually offended some people when I used the term. I think people have gotten over that now, because it's a word like diabetes or heart disease. Mm-hmm. It's a medical condition. as the years went by, the research started building up, the data started building up, and then it was time to write a scientific paper because there was enough really good information. There were great studies that backed up what I was saying. I was saying, hey, 75% of the world is overfat. And people would say, well, do you have data to back that up? I said, well, I have a little bit of data here and a little bit there. And well, that gradually got more and more higher and higher numbers and more data and more scientific studies that could back it up. And then defining overfat was the next step. And I defined it as simply as excess body fat that impairs health. And it impairs fitness too. And if you look at a lot of the athletes, just go to a marathon or a 10K, and you see a lot of overfat runners, overfat athletes, and their health is impaired by that too. That simple definition now can be put together with what people typically understand when they think about body fat, which is, well, isn't it body fat percentage? It is, but who can measure body fat percentage accurately? Hardly anybody, and hardly anybody does it. There's I remember as a student, they had all these gadgets that companies were peddling, for you. This is what you can use in your office to measure body fat. And the accuracy was really quite poor, and the reproducibility was terrible. And you can just, visually look at the patient and come up with a better, more accurate indicator than that. We started saying, well, hey, let's compare the idea of overfat with, let's put it in perspective with percentages, because that data is out there. Good studies have been done about that, and that's easy to relate to as well.
So what's the easy way to measure your overfatness, or something that anyone can do?
Well, let's step back for a second and look at the big picture of this issue of body fat. So we have overfat, what we've been talking about. We have normal fat, and then we have underfat. Underfat and overfat are similar in that they both are abnormal. They both create unhealthy chemicals like chronic inflammation. They both impair the immune system. They both increase the risk of chronic disease and physical impairment, and increase the risk of infection. So they're very similar in that regard. If we look at body fat percentages, because people listening, I know, are thinking, well, what about body fat percentages? Tell us what here's the latest. And I don't use these numbers much because nobody goes out to get measured accurately. You can get a DEXA scan. Those are the tests that people do for bone mass. DEXA will give you body fat percentage quite accurately. But
expensive, though.
And it's not safe. And you don't do a DEXA scan one time because it's like stepping on the scale one time. Oh, yeah, I weigh 150 pounds. Okay. And then you never step on the scale. I mean, how do you relate to anything? So you really would have to do the DEXA once a month or 2-3 times a year. And I don't know, I know one person who does it 2 or 3 times a year, but of all the people I've been working with, talking with for a long time, he's the only one that I've ever heard who regularly does a DEXA to check his body fat.
And you say unsafe because it uses X-rays instead of, like I say, MRI is actually safer.
Well, it's safer, yeah, and you could use MRI, but nobody's going to do an MRI because you want to measure your body fat percentage.
There's also this great Dr. Sean O'Mara. I did a long podcast with him, and he's not a big fan of the DEXA scan, but he uses MRI to measure visceral fat, and he's gotten really good at that.
Yeah, and you could do that, and it's good in a study. It's good for those purposes where we want to find out more information. But there's a simple way, which I'll come back to in a minute. So we've got this overfat, normal fat, underfat model, and let's look at the percentages based on the scientific studies. So there's a range, a healthy range. Percentages in women and men are different, of course. Women have more body fat normally because that's natural and healthy for them, and men have less for the same reason. So the range for women of normal body fat is about 14 to 28%, and the normal range for men is about 8 to 14%. So when we get above 14% in men, that's called overfat. And when we get above 28% in women, that's overfat. Likewise, when we're below 14% body fat in women or below 8% in men, that's called underfat. And again, when our body fat is not normal, our fat cells are not normal either. And that's what's really important. And if we look at the prevalence of underfat, normal fat, and overfat worldwide, I won't use the word interesting. I mean, the word astounding is maybe better. About 8% of the world, it appears, is underfat. Many of those people are malnourished. There are still a lot of people starving in the world, including the Western wealthy nations. But a lot of those people are also, that 8%, are also underfat because of eating disorders or because of overtraining. The overtrained athlete who just runs himself or herself into the ground because of too much volume and too much intensity, combined with typically a low-fat diet. That gets you in trouble. And when we get to normal, how many people have normal body fat? It's about 12% of the world. That leaves us with the 80% of people who are overfat worldwide. In the Western nations, like I said, that rate is higher. The prevalence in the US, for example, of overfat adults is 91%.
Wow. So this is crazy. This is great. You just said that there's only 12% who are abnormal body fatness.
Normal body fat, correct.
And that's actually the same percentage that a recent study showed that 88% of people in America are not metabolically healthy. They use 5 markers, and it wasn't just about body fat, but they use 5 metabolic markers to gauge metabolic health, and it lines up.
Yeah, this lines up with a variety of things. I mean, that when you start to put this information into a scientific paper, you have to have a lot of backup. You just can't come up with these things because they seem right. And so you go through this peer review process, and you go through a bunch of quite often academics. What is this guy talking about? And then he sees the references and he reads all the references. And, so you have to prove your point. That's part of the peer review process, which is not 100% accurate, but it's a pretty good measure. And these line up with other data that we see in published studies. And like I said, over the years, this model has been coming together. And what's really important about it is when we look at what does overfat do, we mentioned, when you're overfat, your cells are sick, they're not healthy. So we have chronic inflammation. Chronic inflammation is the next step before chronic disease. So now we've already started on the pathway of all those preventable chronic diseases that most people die from, especially in the West, although now in developing nations too. The chronic diseases in developing nations have now taken over malnutrition and infectious disease. And that is really sad.
Yeah.
But the sick fat cells compromise our immunity. So now we're, in addition to being vulnerable to preventable chronic diseases, we're now vulnerable to infectious diseases. All those diseases we were supposed to get rid of decades ago, we actually didn't. Here they are today. So the risk of infection is high in people who are overfat. The physical impairment problem, which includes pain, anything that causes pain, directly related to overfat. So when you have a person who's overfat, the trickle-down effect are all these chronic illnesses, chronic physical impairments, and risks of infection, which is basically everything people die from.
Everything that bothers society, everything, and it might not manifest right away. But yeah,
may not manifest right away, but virtually everything. I should use the word virtually, because we have some rare things, genetic disorders, but even if we look at situations like accidents, suicides, we see the same pattern. We see the same predispositions. Depression, for example, is something you see in overfat people,
and maybe even underfat people.
Underfat people too. An auto crash. They used to call them accidents, but they said, hey, guys, these are not accidents. These are preventable actions. So let's call them a crash, not an accident, because these are human error problems. And if our brain is not working right, we can have an error in our brain and crash our car. We always hear about alcohol-related car crashes, but they pale to what's going on with people who are not impaired by alcohol or even drugs, which is a much bigger problem than alcohol. Prescription drugs, I'm talking about. But the person who is not impaired by alcohol or prescription drugs, and they're impaired by their diet. They have a donut for breakfast and they're on the road. Man, I don't want to be near them.
That's an interesting way to look at it too. Or you could be tired. I know so many people that have crashed when they're tired because they have probably a bad metabolism and bad diet.
Yeah, fatigue is one of the most common problems, one of the most common symptoms in overfat people. And it sometimes goes way beyond fatigue. When I was in practice, I saw a lot of patients. I would ask them, how do they feel when they're driving to work in the morning? How do they feel when they're driving back home? It's amazing how many people would get sleepy on their way to work in the morning. And of course, it would happen in the afternoon as well. And of course, people would say, yeah, I'd say, do you get sleepy during the day? Well, yeah, I do. I go to lunch, I come back to my office, and I have to put my head on the desk because I really can't focus. Man, that's a serious problem. That's probably an overfat problem. It's at least a blood sugar problem that is indicative that you will be overfat really soon if you're not.
I was there back, even when I was eating pretty healthy, like 6-7 years ago. I would, have to take a nap almost after at work, but I've never had that since.
Yeah, I mean, the things that we have gotten used to in our society that are abnormal, like feeling tired after a meal, getting sleepy, being cranky if we don't eat on time, waking up in the middle of the night because you have to pee. You don't wake up because you have to pee. You wake up because your stress hormones are starting to rise because you're stressed. And so we have to start looking at all these signs and symptoms that we're so used to seeing in patients or in ourselves that we've made the leap from this is really, really common to this must be normal because it's so common.
Yeah.
And it's really sad.
No, it is. We just accept it these days. What would happen if everyone had the right body composition and everyone was eating the right diet? Man,
what a question. Is that a loaded question? I don't know if you saw my article a couple of years ago about, I don't remember the name of it, but you can search it on my website. Basically, the question is, how quickly can we fix this problem, this overfat problem? And the answer is very quick. And the reason I know that is because I've been doing it with patients and consulting with people my whole career, and I see how quickly people can change. So I see how they go from overfat to normal fat, sometimes in 2, 3, 4 months. Sometimes it takes them 6 months. Sometimes it takes them a year because they're so overfat that it takes longer to happen. But it's not just the overfat, it's what the overfat problem created, because along the way, they not only start losing excess body fat, but now the medication they're on for hypertension, for example, is no longer needed, because as you reduce your body fat, your blood pressure, if it's too high, will normalize. And if your blood sugar is high and you're diabetic, if you reduce your body fat to normal, you may be able to cut down or eliminate your medication, and on and on and on. So let's say, most of the world says, okay, we're going to stop eating sugar and refined carbohydrates. Just one recommendation. That's all I'm saying. You talk to people about nutrition. They say, well, what should I do about this? What about protein? What about that? Don't pay any attention to anything. Do one thing. I just want to make one recommendation. Stop eating sugar and sugar-containing foods and refined carbohydrates, which turn to sugar. It's all the same refined carbohydrate that needs to be avoided. And if that was done, what would happen in a year? I can tell you one thing that would happen is that we would have an economic crash on Wall Street that would make the real estate crash of when was that, 2006?
08, 07, 08, yeah.
07, whenever, look like an afterthought, because just look at the so-called healthcare stocks. They're disease care stocks, and they are booming. Booming isn't the word. They're off the charts. People are making a lot of money, and all of a sudden, if people get healthy and they don't need the medications and they don't need the therapies and they don't need to spend money on the surgeries and the whatever care that is the result of being overfat, it changes in the course of a year. What a disaster. Do I wish that on anybody? No. Would I like people to do this in a year? Yes. And if we have to suffer those consequences, so be it. Why do we want to, take our time? That doesn't make any sense. So it can happen very quickly. And again, the world isn't going to say that, because in order for that to happen, governments and all the health organizations need to admit that there's a consensus and we're going to do something about it. What's interesting, at the end of this COVID-19 pandemic, what has happened is a lesson that we should pay attention to, because it's what we're talking about. Can we change the world in a year? We can. We did it in a few weeks. Unfortunately, it was done because of panic. The population was scared to death. The politicians, whatever it is they did. And we, the people, I didn't make these changes, but the population went from one life to a very different life. So many things changed, and they really changed in a matter of days and weeks. And so if they can do that for a problem that what it was, then if we say, hey, overfat is the cause of most chronic disease, most physical impairments, most pain, and most risk of infectious disease, can we get rid of that overfat state very quickly? Well, we can, and let's do it. But I don't trust the powers that be to do that. And again, we come back to that issue of we can still do it because it's up to us as individuals.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, everyone can do it on their own. I don't see a world where they're ever going to just make these big recommendations and make everyone change. It's just never going to happen. It's just not how our world works.
Yeah, we're still selling one of the worst drugs in the world, the worst drug in the world, all over the world every day. It's called alcohol. We know cigarettes are really, really bad, but they're still making them. And tobacco companies are saying today that it's not clear whether tobacco is harmful. We need to do more studies. If we have to go down that road and deal with those kinds of people, I don't know how much we can get out of, the people associated with those kinds of, that way of thinking.
It's not going to work. I mean, yeah, people do it on their own. I just want them to at least allow it as an option. I know they're never going to recommend it, and they're always going to say, oh, calories, just, drink Coca-Cola, but manage your calories, all this type of stuff. But at least if it's a healthy alternative, say like high fat, low carb is okay. That's the dream. But
well, that's still not happening, and that's a ways off. But we as individuals can do it on our own, and it's really quite easy. And, we as a population in particular, and humans have always accomplished things from a grassroots level. Mm-hmm. It's one person sharing information, and now you've got several people doing it, and then that grows into more and more people. And I've seen this growth come and go my whole career. It was not that long ago when I was telling people to not eat sugar, and fat was healthy. It's okay to eat natural fats. And don't worry about the protein. You need a certain amount of protein, and don't count calories and don't get on the scale. And they thought I was nuts. And telling an athlete who was training for a marathon to cut out all refined carbohydrates and cut back on natural carbohydrates, because we want to create a state where you're burning more fat for energy, not just glucose, because fat will restore, or fat will preserve your glycogen stores. So when you're a few miles from the finish, you can kick in those glycogen stores and sprint and blah, blah, blah. I was a nutcase in town, in my community. And gradually, suddenly somebody wins a marathon that I'm working with. And suddenly somebody's off medication, and then another person's off medication, and somebody wins the Ironman. And, that outcome effect is something that people start paying attention to. And then they say, well, I know he's pretty weird, but I think I'm going to go see this guy. Mm-hmm. And it just built. And there were other people doing what I was doing. And here we are today. I'm hoping it stays.
Mm-hmm. When did you first, I think we talked this week, when did you first go keto, or like you tried like a high fat diet? And
I first experienced ketosis when I was in undergraduate school. So it was like 1972. And I did it with a fast. I had a 10 or 12 day fast, just water. I felt pretty bad. I was feeling pretty bad every day anyway. So I figured how much worse could I feel? But I did feel worse for 2 days. And then all of a sudden, it was like a miracle. I wondered why I was feeling so good. And as the days went by, I started getting a little bit scared. I thought, what's going on? Why should I feel this good? And I was actually, as a student, you had to work. I had to work to pay my tuition and stuff. And I was working in a restaurant, in a steakhouse as a waiter. And it was quite a trip. It was a very interesting experience because I knew enough about biology. I knew enough about physiology and blood sugar. And I had this crazy thought that we're using fat for energy. Why doesn't anybody ever talk about that? Why can't I even find stuff to read about it? And it really got me putting things together.
Wow. Yeah, that's early.
Yeah. And then I eventually realized that, hey, I can go into ketosis without fasting. I could eat healthy food and I can fast every night for 12 hours and get the benefits of, a 12-day fast or whatever fasting you want to do, and get those ketones coming out, have my fat burning take place. So now I have unlimited energy. My brain has unlimited energy because it uses ketones. My sugar is conserved. If I'm in a stressful situation, I have plenty of sugar to draw upon if that should happen. And things just worked better. And the hard part wasn't seeing how great things could be. The hard part was explaining it to people. No, the science didn't exist. We had some ideas. There were people writing a book. I remember I was lecturing, I think it was 1982. And whenever I would lecture, I would go out for a 20-minute walk by myself and kind of as a warm-up. And I remember walking by this antique store, and in the window was this little book called Eat Fat to Get Slim. It was 1959. It was a U.S. publication. It was by the same Dr. Robertson, who wrote the same book in England. It was a bestseller in both countries, as far as I know. And it wasn't really a diet book, which is what I liked, because by then I knew that diet books should be avoided. They should be banned like cigarettes, because they do more harm than good. But it was a way of eating, and that's what I was trying to do. Let's have a way of eating. How do humans eat? This is how humans eat. So we had a kind of a blueprint about how humans eat. And now my goal was always to help people personalize their health and fitness, because we have this blueprint of how humans should eat: low carbohydrate, high fat, moderate protein. That's sort of how the earliest humans ate. That's how we developed such big brains and big, strong bodies and had longevity. And, it marked such a big shift in humanity. But we want to tweak that, and we can do that by helping people personalize it. And that, that's the rest is kind of history.
Yeah. Sapien diet right there. So tell us more about what you do. I mean, you're talking about running, you're talking about all kinds of stuff and coaching people. Just real quick.
What I'm doing, it depends on the day. Somebody in an interview not too long ago, somebody asked me what I'm most proud of. And I didn't really know what to say, but I'm most proud of the fact that I wear so many different hats. So I've learned to shift my brain. I learned this a long time ago. I've learned to shift gears in my brain, and I could be crunching data or reading some heavy duty scientific study, and then I realized that I was working on this simple article for general audience, and I got stuck on how I explain this, and suddenly it all comes to me. So I stop the scientific stuff, I shift into my general audience article, and I write the sentence that I've been missing for a week, and I'm finished the article. Or I'm doing something and suddenly a song comes out of my mind. I'm a professional songwriter. And I've learned, as Neil Young said, when a song starts coming out, you have to excuse yourself and go write the song. And otherwise you forget it. And it's a terrible thing to forget a song, because your brain has put this thing together, it's sent it out, and there it is. And I want it. So I just stop whatever it is I'm doing. I pick up my guitar, go to the piano, and write this song. And I exercise regularly. I eat well. I'm always having fun. I've always had that idea. I always want to have fun. And for a while I thought, this is kind of selfish. You're supposed to work hard and then retire, and then you get bored, I guess. I don't know. But I never went for that. You should have fun in everything you do. I have fun in everything I do with my work. I don't even call it work. And I don't ever see retiring. What would the point of that be? The human body, we get to a point when we're, late 20s into our 30s, where we start seeing the early signs of aging. We're not as quick. Our reflexes are a little slower as they used to be. We can start seeing measurable reductions in strength. And as we get to 40 and 50 and 60, we see these things continue. But our brain is different. Our brain can keep getting better and better and better, but we have to feed it, not just nutrition, but we have to feed it information. We have to have those aha moments. We have to have passion. What I got when I was in undergraduate school was the passion to help people, and that kept me going. And I still have that, and I've done it so many different ways.
You work with athletes too?
I worked with a lot of athletes in virtually all sports from the beginning. It's such an exciting thing, because I was an athlete. I don't know that I lived my life through the athletes I coached, who were much better than me. But I enjoyed the idea of, how can we improve human performance in this person even more than we have, or even more than they have? And how can we do it in a healthy way? The problem we have in our society now is that athletes are becoming unhealthy. And I wrote a paper called Athletes Fit But Unhealthy. And what we do is we have this no pain, no gain thing that I mentioned early on. And people are willing to sacrifice their health for more fitness. I mean, movies have been written about that idea. But we're still thinking it today because of companies that promote no pain, no gain. The image of, being hurt, and I'm going to go for a run today. Well, my knee really hurts, but, my competitors are putting the miles in. I got to do it too. It's really sad. And so when I would see an athlete, I would often have them reduce their miles, reduce their intensity, of course, eat differently, like I was talking about before. In the beginning, that was like, what is this guy talking about? He wants me to train slow to get fast? Well, that's just what happens, oddly enough. And you do it without sacrificing your health. So now you've got an athlete who's both fit and unhealthy. And now that athlete has a longer career, performs better, and it's a wonderful thing to see. And I apply the same things to any and all human performance, whether it's the corporate executive, the student, the professor, the researcher, musicians. When musicians are on tour, I treat them like athletes who are on the circuit. They need to eat a certain way to perform their best, and there's certain rules that they should follow, and now they're going to play their best. They're going to talk their best in interviews, et cetera, et cetera. It's human performance, and we control our human performance. Unfortunately, today, we have that devil out there, the junk food, the refined food, the companies saying, eat our products. And so it's hard for us to rationalize not doing that because
Mm.
it's in our brain. I mean, who doesn't remember all those junk food ads and those cigarette ads if you're old enough? We have that to overcome, but it can be done.
Yeah, you talked about these marathoners that are over fat. How does that work? Because I've noticed that a lot, and it's come up a few times.
Yeah, the concept that we used to think was that if we just exercise, we're going to burn calories and we're going to lose weight. And if we don't eat a lot of calories, that's even better. But the reality is, when people say that to me, I ask them a question and I say, calories of what? That's the reality.
Mm-hmm.
What calories are we talking about? What calories are you burning?
Mm-hmm.
And then people get confused because they think a calorie is a calorie, but it's not. If you're burning a lot of sugar calories, it means you're not burning fat calories, which means the fat in storage is not coming out of storage to be used for energy. But if you're burning a lot of fat calories, now you have more energy to do a workout or a race, and the fat is coming out of storage to be burned. The fact is we burn both sugar and fat. We burn ketones too, but we burn sugar and fat, and that mix of fuels is what's important. Those athletes who are finishing the race up front, including the winner, burns more fat than the people behind him.
Mm.
And that's the kind of athlete we want to be. And so it's possible as an athlete to be putting in a lot of miles and at high intensity where we burn more calories. But if we're not burning fat calories, it's not helping us. And the reality is that the food has a greater impact on us, not just from a weight and body fat standpoint, but from a health standpoint. Food has a greater impact than exercise. And so we can be a fit but unhealthy athlete. And in some cases, that may mean we are an overfat athlete who could run a 3-hour marathon or a 4-hour marathon. That's a respectable thing for an age group individual to do. And so we need to start with the food. I did that study I mentioned showing that 91% of Americans were overfat. I think that's about 2 years old now. In that same study, there was data from the CDC that nobody had ever really looked at. And I saw that the population, the US population, was increasing in prevalence of exercise. So people were doing more aerobic exercise and more strength training exercises. And while the prevalence of exercise was increasing, so was the prevalence of overfat. That was interesting. It was logical. It was no surprise to me, but I was surprised that the data was just sitting there waiting for somebody to grab it and say, hey, this idea that our food influences us more than exercise is real, and here's the data.
Yeah, I think that's super important for people to know because food is way more important, even though you're an exercise person, but it's good to admit this.
For years, let me just throw this in because the trend has been, and a lot of people, I hear it all the time still. People say, oh, well, I eat this because I know I'm going to burn it off. And that's it. I could eat it. If I have an extra piece of cake the night before, I just run an extra couple of miles the next morning. Come on, grow up. This is 2020. I mean, and plus we knew this 30, 40 years ago anyway, but now it's pretty clear and they're just mimicking what the TV commercials are telling them.
Yeah. And what like the Coca-Cola, these institutes they make to try to talk about calorie balance are telling them these like bogus. I want to wrap around to so many things. So first, that wasn't a leading question a while ago. I didn't read that paper. I read 4 of your papers, but not the one about, what if we all get healthy? And also, we didn't talk about the easy way to measure overfatness, the easy way that's free at home.
Free and easy, and it's called the waist to height ratio. It sounds a little complicated, but it isn't. Through the years, scientists have been measuring the body and trying to figure out, are there measurements that would accurately portray things, including body fat? And finally, a few years ago, the waist to height ratio seemed to be standing the test of time. And that's the one I've written a lot about because it's quite accurate. It compares to a DEXA, it compares to a lot of the other measures that are quite objective. And the waist to height ratio is something that everyone in the world can use. Men, women, children, all ethnicities. And you basically measure your waist at the level of your umbilicus, your belly button, and you measure your height. Don't assume your height is the same as what your driver's license says, because sometimes people cheat a little bit, even way back when you're 16. And that ratio needs to be 0.5 or below. So what it means is your waist should be less than half your height. The waist should be less than half your height.
At the belly button, not the pants.
Correct, at the belly button. And if you take a string and cut it to your height, a string that doesn't stretch or won't shrink, and then fold it in half, that's your belly button waist measurement.
Max.
And you can check that once a month. I wouldn't recommend checking it every day because that's called obsession. But check it once a month, and A, it'll tell you if you're getting rid of fat, if you have too much, or B, if you're gaining it. And it's a nice, how long does it take to wrap that thing around your waist?
It's so huge. And I've had people talk about it from actually first episode, Dr. Ted Damon, who talks a lot about this stuff that you've been bringing up today, brought it up in episode 1 of this podcast. It's so important. And he says it could do more than any other measurement. This is all he really cares about with his patients. I hover around 0.4. You don't want to go too low, I'm guessing, 0.42.
You don't want to go too low. Again, we need some body fat.
Yeah.
And, there are people who are obsessed when I don't know what they see, but if they see something and they think it's fat. And the waist to height ratio is so good. There's scientific studies that have done, I've used it in my studies. So it's a well-accepted measurement. There's a consensus on it. Is it going to replace weight and obesity? Not too soon, despite the science of it. And clinically, we've known these things for a long time. But now the consensus is on the scientific level as well, which is a step closer to, this worldwide consensus, which sometimes we get to and sometimes we don't. What's good is that everyone has the ability to use waist to height ratio as a tool to personalize the process. And they could use it on themselves, they can use it on their families, they could use it on their kids. And what's important about a tool like this is that it's a very accurate tool. Like I said, the consensus is there scientifically. And so we don't need any of the other stuff. We don't need the scale. We don't need BMI. Whatever we're doing with our lifestyle, which we control, if it's working, we see it in our waist. If it's not working, we see it.
I love it. So it does go back to Dr. Sean O'Mara, great podcast on that. It is kind of a measure of that visceral fat. And it really goes back to my recent episode with Dr. Stu Phillips. It's a great researcher who talks about muscle and all this stuff. And the scale is so meaningless, this BMI stuff, because he did all these studies and people who they gained muscle and lost fat, they checked with the DEXA. So their weight at the end was the same. And then there's another group that didn't get enough protein and they lost more muscle. They didn't lose as much fat, but the scale couldn't tell you this, right? The scale couldn't tell you how much fat. I have a friend who I'm helping change his body composition right now. And I don't say I'm helping him lose weight because that's wrong, because he actually hasn't lost that much weight, but his entire body composition has changed because he's lost fat at the same time he's put on muscle.
Yeah, I've had patients, when I was in practice, I didn't see patients that often. So they were kind of on their own for a while, and then they'd come back and see me. And I've had people who would come back and be really upset, be really stressed because they hadn't lost weight. And I'd say, well, you look pretty good. Have people been asking you if you're losing weight? And they'd say, well, yeah, that's part of the problem. People would ask if I'm losing weight, and I'd go weigh myself. I know you told me not to get on the scale, but I couldn't help it because they'd say, are you losing weight? And I wouldn't see that I've lost weight. And sometimes I say, and I had to buy all new clothes because my clothes didn't fit. And they were stressed and upset anyway. I think that's all changing. I think people are slowly, finally understanding about these relationships. And you mentioned visceral fat, abdominal, or what's now called abdominal overfat, which are the people who are normal weight and non-obese, and they have excess abdominal fat, and that's called abdominal overfat. There's something unique about abdominal overfat in that it's much worse for the body than all the other fat stores. And in addition to that, it's an indication of the fat around the heart. Mm-hmm. So what you see in the belly is also around the heart. And if you have excess body fat around the heart, your heart's in trouble.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, all the fat in the wrong places. That's the pericardial fat, or like you have the fat around the liver, you have fat that's what happens.
Everywhere. And it's one of the functions of healthy fat is that it cushions our organs and glands. So when we go out for a run, the so-called trauma of, hitting the ground, which shouldn't hurt us, cushions the kidney and cushions the heart. And when we get overfat or underfat, that fat no longer can function in a healthy way.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we need to wrap around with way more things. Here's a small one I want to throw back in. You talking about getting rid of the sugar and the refined grains. What do you think about throwing the refined oils, the seed oils, in that mix?
Well, the oils are an example of other food components that we need to talk about because it's very important. The bad oils, the low protein intake, the chemicals that are in foods and our water supply. One of the big things that promotes chronic inflammation is sugar, as we alluded to, but sugar directly promotes chronic inflammation and pain. And the other thing that is really good at promoting chronic inflammation and pain is the omega-6 oils, the vegetable oils. So we're talking about corn, peanuts, safflower, canola,
soy.
These are omega-6 oils. These are the oils that we've been told for years we should be eating more of. They made margarine out of these oils. Of course it's healthy. And no, if we eat vegetables that contain those oils, it's not a problem because we're not eating them in excess. But when we dump some oil on our salad, some peanut oil or canola oil, that's a high concentration of omega-6 oils. And when we consume too much of that, it biochemically shifts some chemicals around that produce inflammatory chemicals. Mm-hmm. And that's something we want to avoid.
Yeah. I've had a lot of great podcasts lately with some people talking about that kind of stuff.
Yeah. So that mechanism is I think it's such a fun mechanism to look at. It's called the essential fatty acid cascades. And it incorporates the omega-6 and the omega-3 fats and how they all metabolize to produce either inflammatory or anti-inflammatory compounds, which regulate not just pain, but hormones and development of cancer and all kinds of things. And that little mechanism, that essential fatty acid cascade I've done so many 12-hour lectures just on that to doctors. It's a biochemistry lecture, but it shows you how we can implement lifestyle changes to, for example, interfere with the production of too many inflammatory hormones. We need inflammatory hormones. That's how we recover from exercise or even a day at the office. We have to recover, and we use these inflammatory chemicals to do that. But then we have our anti-inflammatories come in and take over, and they get rid of the inflammation, and we're kind of back to normal. That's called recovery. And that mechanism is under lifestyle control. So sugar drives the process of excess inflammation. The omega-6 oil does the same thing. Stress can do the same thing. Low protein can do the same thing. And so, again, we're looking at lifestyle affecting us in a dramatic way.
Yeah, I love that. That brings it all together. And I'm going to bring it all together even more this whole podcast. When we go back to the beginning, we start talking about the coronavirus, stuff like that, and immune system and health, all this. You wrote a paper called The Perfect Storm, Coronavirus Pandemic Meets Overfat Pandemic. So let's jump back into that. We kind of teased it in the beginning and then never talked about it.
Yeah, I guess the bottom line is who's getting sick and who's dying from this infection. And never mind all the other things that we hear that are inaccurate or hype and why people are panicking and so on and so forth. Who's really at the high risk and who's dying? It's the people who, for the most part, are overfat and have those downstream overfat conditions. They're called comorbidities. So these are people who have cancer, heart disease, respiratory illness, diabetes. And it's not so much people who are 65 and older, or 60 and over, or 70 and over. It happens to be that those are the people who have these diseases because they've been around long enough to accumulate them.
And living the standard American way, or Western way, exactly. Yeah. It's just saying just because you're old doesn't mean you're going to get it. It's just that they all happen to have these. Yeah.
Yep, exactly. And so if we want to control a pandemic, it makes sense to quarantine. It makes sense to quarantine sugar, but it makes sense to quarantine the people who are most at risk from contracting the disease and therefore spread the disease much easier because the viral shedding is going to be high and or associated with transmission. And we shouldn't be, keeping kids out of school. We should be keeping teachers out of school who are at high risk. And okay, if you want to take some people's temperature at the door, okay, play that game. And people aren't spreading the disease out in public. They're spreading it mostly at home. We didn't see it in the US, but I saw it in other countries where they were saying you can't kiss people in your family. And I thought it was odd that you didn't see that in the US. I don't know. Do they think people don't kiss anymore here? I don't know. But, there's certain conditions where transmissions are much easier. And there's certain things we can do that can reduce the risk of transmissions. And I'm not opposed to doing those, but I am opposed to being so obsessed about it and being panicked about it that people run to the stores and buy out all the junk food. And I guess it's no surprise that they buy the toilet paper as well, because now they're eating even more junk food and they're going to need the toilet paper.
Yeah, that is terrible that everyone's promoting comfort food. The media's like, oh, get your comfort food. And it's crazy. The only restaurants that were open during some of this were these fast food restaurants with
junk food. Yeah. And who's advertising on the media, the networks and in the newspapers and magazines? The junk food company.
Oh, it's all food related junk food.
You don't see advertising for lettuce and Brussels sprouts.
Yeah. Well, okay. So tell us more about the immune system and the health and the overfat and viruses.
So the reason for the paper, COVID-19 pandemic meets overfat pandemic, is that it is a perfect storm in the negative sense that, we've created a nightmare. This is a huge problem. And of course, this COVID-19 pandemic hit. And of course, it's the reason another pandemic is going to show up in the coming years. And could COVID-19 reemerge as COVID-20 or 21? It's possible. It's also possible that they're going to lump COVID-19 in with all the other seasonal viruses like they did from the 2009 pandemic, which nobody remembers, which is the H1N1. They just said, oh, this is interesting. Let's put it in with the 100 or so other seasonal flu bugs, and, which we still have. We still have a very serious annual seasonal flu that kills a lot of people. And we just don't have the numbers yet to say, is COVID-19 similar to the seasonal flu? It is similar, as opposed to Ebola. If we had an Ebola pandemic, there's no comparison. Ebola is pretty serious, and if it did anywhere near what happened with COVID-19, half the world would be dead now. We have this, all these issues that we need to pay attention to, but what we need to pay attention to most is our immune systems, because this is what prevents people from getting sick. The germ theory is that, there's some virus out there hiding behind the tree, and you walk by and the virus jumps on you and you get sick. It doesn't work that way. These viruses are always around. They're always among us and in us. And we are able to fight off these infections. And I use that word fight kind of loosely because that's what the immune system does. It fights off
doing its job.
Invading organism. That's its job. It's always been the job of the human immune system to do that, because there have always been viruses and bacteria and other microbes out there trying to get at us. We've created this great immune system that prevents that. And if we're over fat, our immune system is crashed and it doesn't work as well. And that's really, in a sense, the bottom line here.
Yeah, I need to do another rant here, because this is crazy to me that people still think that they can hide from a virus, or that the virus is the problem. There are viruses always going around. I haven't been sick in years and years and years. And the only times I used to get sick were, say, around my finals, my midterms, or when I completely crashed my immune system back in the day, when I would go out all weekend and travel and stay up late and not sleep. And then I would get sick. So is that the one moment that this magical virus just came into existence and I walked by and I got it? So for a whole year, if I don't get sick, and then the one time that I don't sleep, I'm stressed out and eat bad food and run down my immune system, and then I get sick, you think it's some magic coincidence? No, it's like...
Well, no, what you're saying is correct. You are most vulnerable at that point. But
exactly. They're always there.
That's not what causes pandemics. What causes pandemics is enough unhealthy people to contract the infection and transmit it.
Yeah, exactly. Well, yeah, like whatever percent you were talking about, how many percent of the people in the world are over fat, and
right, and it's no coincidence that the U.S. has virtually the most numbers of over fat people per million. Actually, Iceland has more. Interesting. There's some other tiny countries that have more, but it's also interesting that the numbers of COVID-19 cases per million is highest in America.
Yeah, it doesn't kind of correlate to the countries. You could probably...
Sure does. It sure does. It also correlates with another topic that we thought we were going to talk about, but I'll bring it up now, and that's vitamin D.
Yeah.
Because vitamin D is a very serious problem. There's so many people who are low. I just call it low. They're either deficient or insufficient. There's a terminology problem that scientists have now, and clinicians and laboratories, and they're trying to, dance around these issues. But if your vitamin D is low because you haven't gotten enough sun exposure in a healthy body, overfat people can't get much vitamin D from the sun, then your immune system is also going to be impaired, because vitamin D is very important for a healthy immune system. So the countries that are high up or low down versus the countries that are more in the sunny area geographically along the equator is where you tend to see higher numbers of COVID-19 cases.
I've had multiple podcasts about this, and there's a lot of studies. There's many studies have come out to show these high correlations to the vitamin D status and the severity of the case.
Yeah, finally. I mean, they're finally putting the data. I mean, the data is out there. I mentioned it, in my COVID paper with Paul Larson, and we, I said, look, let's put a map in here on vitamin D, and it was a tough sell. And then all of a sudden, more and more people started talking about it. But it's a hopefully it's going to bring up the issue that vitamin D deficiency and insufficiency are problems that are just epidemic everywhere. And it affects our brain, it affects our immune system, our muscles, our bones. And we have had decades of scare tactics about being in the sun and using sunscreen, and the cosmetic companies who makes the sunscreens, have been really hardcore on don't go in the sun without, don't go get your mail and you got to put sunscreen on first. I think it was I worked in the golf world quite a bit, and I did a TV segment with David Ledbetter on the Golf Channel. I think this was 2000, 2001 maybe. And we're talking about sunshine and vitamin D, which was unheard of back then. And he said, well, how do you prevent getting a burn? Mm-hmm. If you're playing 18 holes of golf, or if you're in a tournament, you're playing 36. And I said, well, the best protection against a burn is to get a good tan. Mm-hmm. And it was a really good answer. Of course, you got to get your tan first. But the bottom line is you don't want to burn ever.
Yeah, for
but
sure.
I got a call. I started getting calls from the channel, not too long after, and they said we're getting all these calls and letters from dermatologists saying, "Please take this off the air. Don't this guy's crazy. This is harmful. Blah blah blah." And I think we've kind of gotten over that now. I think we're finally sensing that the paranoia and the hype about sunscreen and sun phobia.
Well,
and again, humans have been in the sun from the beginning, and when humans migrated out of North Africa, those who went north lost their dark skin, and those who went south got darker. We're all cousins.
Yeah.
We're all the same humans. But if we have darker skin, whether it's because we have gotten tanned or because we have naturally dark skin, we need more sun exposure. And if we have really light skin, we have to be very careful, but still get some sun exposure.
What kind of levels do you like vitamin D at?
I'd like to see them around 50. I think there's studies that show 60 and 70 and higher are levels that are good for preventing melanoma.
Which is counterintuitive to people.
It is. But vitamin D, high levels of vitamin D are protective, not just from an immunity standpoint, but from a cancer standpoint. And the immunity and the immune system and the cancer is connected, but preventing a lot of cancers, including skin cancer. So those numbers need to be higher. There's a natural response. So as we get more and more tan and as we build our vitamin D levels up, we don't build up as much because now we're more tan. And then for those of us in the US or in many countries at that level, we need those high levels at the end of the summer because by fall and certainly by early winter, we may not get any vitamin D from the sun, but we have this ability to store that vitamin E and have it last us through the winter until the spring when we start getting the sunshine again.
Exactly. Yeah, we store it up like bears store fat. And also, just to throw in again, we brought up many times, but the flu season, as we know it, is when we have the lowest vitamin D.
Yep, exactly. And it's combined with when we eat a lot of junk and when we're most stressed. So Halloween is the start of the flu season, and then it goes through those crazy holidays that people promise themselves are not going to do again this year, but they do. They gain the weight like they did previous years, and they're low in vitamin D. And so between the low vitamin D, the stress, and the increased sugar, it doesn't take a genius to, put all that together and see the risk being at a very high level.
Yeah, it's all about the immune system. So go again, maybe a little bit more into the mechanisms. We don't have to get crazy, like scientific here, but with the coronavirus and how viruses work, and there's like cytokines, and there's all this type of stuff going on with a virus and with the immune system, and I guess even fat cells and overfat.
Yeah, and all that's true. What was missed is that you have what the viruses do is they create their own acute inflammation. It's called hyperinflammation. So if you create hyperinflammation, your body's response to that is to, it's a big fire. Your body wants to put that fire out. So it has these natural anti-inflammatory chemicals to come to the rescue. But if you're overfat, you're already making a lot of inflammatory chemicals. You already have chronic inflammation. Now you add hyperinflammation to that. Plus, you don't have enough of your natural anti-inflammatory chemicals because you're making all these inflammatory ones because you're overfat. It's a recipe for disaster. And then you add to that the immune response or the lack of immune response in someone who has excess body fat. Body fat has macrophages and all these cells that when we talk about the immune system, those are the components of the immune system. And a lot of them reside in fat cells in our fat storage areas. But when we are overfat, those normal fat cells become abnormal. They become sick, and those immune cells no longer work well. So the immune functions go downhill. And when we talk about having poor immunity, that's what's happening.
That makes sense. So this is kind of my idea. Many people share this. Like, this is the one thing you can control in this. You can control your own health. You can control your immune system. But why is the media not talking about this part, or the politicians? Is it because they don't know? I don't get it. Like, they're just talking about some magical vaccine that we've never had a vaccine that works for any coronavirus. Like, why are we focusing on that?
The other interesting thing is that if you're over fat, vaccines don't work very well.
Oh, isn't there a study that shows that is true? The flu vaccine, the normal flu vaccine.
I referenced that in my COVID-19 Overfat study.
Just with the flu, it was just like the normal flu vaccine works less on
any
Overfat.
vaccine. Yeah. And so let's back up to December and January. I think the media was kind of at a slow time, and I'm not saying anything negative about anything, but I think the combination of politics and a slow news day and a mutation, this is like a mutated virus. That's like a cool thing. That's like science fiction. How cool is that? Mm-hmm. What a wonderful headline. We need headlines to sell newspapers. That's the old idea. It's still true today.
Well, clicks now. Yeah. Sell clicks.
Yeah. And so it was, in a sense, another perfect storm. And the question is, if COVID-19 is not much different in terms of infectious rates, death, et cetera, than the seasonal flu. And it's really not. It's similar. It's not identical. The problem is we don't know yet, because they're going to be downgrading the numbers soon. Mm-hmm. Mark my word. The difference was not great. Why did the media jump on this COVID-19 thing so much? Well, it's because they didn't have much to do. And that's kind of a tongue-in-cheek phrase. There wasn't a lot going on. Mm-hmm. You can read the news cycles when they're reporting on Joe's bird feeder being attacked by a deer in his backyard. They're really struggling to find something to report. But the point is, if COVID-19 is not that much different than the seasonal flu, why don't they talk about the seasonal flu and all the deaths that it causes every year? Mm-hmm. And why did they pretty much ignore it and hype up the COVID-19 issue? I don't know the answer to that. Was there some politics going on that with the slow news, and that made the perfect storm? I don't know the answers. I don't watch TV. I don't read the newspapers unless I'm writing an article, and then I take a peek to see what's being discussed. And I'm usually quite offended by the accuracy of these media reports. My feeling was that it was all going to disappear by May 1st. It didn't. They're still talking about, these rising numbers. I don't know if that's true. They're still talking about the fact that it's not going to disappear, and we're going to go into the fall, and it's just going to get much worse than it ever was. And, I don't
crazy.
Go for that either.
Oh, yeah. So there's a lot of things we got to talk about, even though we're running out of time. They report, I just quickly Googled this, and I posted about it on social media the other day. The rise in testing, they keep saying there's more cases, but they don't say how much more testing they're doing. And I just looked on Google, the most liberal, the most people that are supporting all this, and it's directly correlated how many new cases are with how much testing they're doing, for one thing. Then I just Googled the death rate. And again, MSNBC, big liberal news source, they just had all these different states and their curves. They had the bell curve of the deaths, which is the important part, because if people are just getting it and not having any symptoms, either asymptomatic or fine, then that's not a big deal. That's just like people just get the flu. Yes. So what we care is death. Is this lethal? And the death rates they all rose and fell. The death rate is not going up. The media is reporting there's more cases. They're trying to perpetuate this. And there's all kinds of conspiracy theories out there of why the media wants to perpetuate this. Is there bigger powers? Whatever. I don't care about all that stuff. All I know is they keep reporting there's new cases. They're trying to drag this out when the death rate has gone down. It's risen and fallen. These viruses have their pattern. They go up. It's a bell curve, and they come back down, and that's across the board. These states all look the same. So this is the whole thing about, may sound insensitive to some people, but there's a certain amount of the population that is vulnerable, and they are going to die in the flu season, or they're going to die of something else. And this is what the coronavirus is exposing. It's getting those people, and then it goes back down. This is obvious. This is what happens at all times. And there's these people that are just going to lock down forever. And I feel like there's creating a huge divide in the country over this, even the masks.
Well, it is. Yeah, the masks are dividing people. It's like the North against the South, or, whatever. And what's happened, interestingly enough, the hype and the panic has enlisted doctors and clinicians and scientists in some cases, especially in the beginning. Because it was ripe for people to think of, the 1918 flu pandemic. I just want to read a sentence from the conclusion of that paper on COVID and Overfat. And I paraphrased Jones, who's a researcher, writing in the New England Journal of Medicine that while some experts warn half the world's population could be infected by COVID-19 by the end of 2020, resulting in more than 100 million deaths, such a perfect storm is exceedingly rare. It is, however, regrettably one that is possible. So, this was this the end of December, early January maybe? And so it's an example of how the people who, in science and clinicians, people writing in the New England Journal of Medicine are a bit concerned about this. And as we should be, because look at how many people are over fat, and what would it take for this perfect storm to get even more perfect, if one could say that. It's possible, sure, but it's just highly unlikely. These things are coming and going. Our public health today is quite different than it was 100 years ago. So we've eliminated a lot of predispositions, a lot of things that make these pandemics much worse. But we've also added one, the overfat pandemic. This is really what we as individuals need to work on. And if, writing our congressman saying, we've got to get rid of sugar isn't going to work. But what does work is for us to take charge of the situation and just say, okay, I'm not eating sugar. I'm not eating refined carbohydrates anymore. I'm throwing everything out of my house. And if, the rest of my family doesn't want to do that, then they could move out. Or I'll move out.
That's great. Yeah, I love that. And I don't know if you want to comment on that. Like, do you agree with my kind of thing of the virus rises and falls? It has its pattern. You can't hide from a virus. It gets the vulnerable. And that's just what happens in every virus?
The pattern appears to be similar, yeah, without a doubt. And the problem that we have with COVID-19 is there's a lot of cases reported that may not be COVID-19. And when we go back and look at the data and go back to evaluate who we're counting and what we're counting and who we're not counting and so forth, I think you're going to see the numbers of cases and deaths go down. And then I think it's going to look pretty much like a seasonal flu.
Well, yes. And even if you look at the entire, like how many people would have died of anything, if you look at all cause mortality of everything, there's a lot of data and a lot of people talk about that it could be by the end of the year, it's going to be the same, right? There is, right?
Yeah. And that's an important point because these people are overfat, and they have all the downstream comorbidities, cancer, heart disease, diabetes, a respiratory illness, and so forth. And, it's not fair to say the people who are dying are going to die soon anyway, but that's the reality of it. Mm-hmm. These are the people who are closest to death, and add one big stress like an infection and they die. That's in reality how a lot of people with heart disease die, with cancer, late stage cancer, with diabetes. They get pneumonia. They're in the hospital, they get pneumonia, and they die. So what gets written on the birth certificate?
Death certificate.
Or the death certificate. Is it cancer? Is it heart disease? Is it pneumonia? And this question about what's written on the death certificate is a question for COVID-19 because what really did this patient die from? Why are so many people getting sick with this COVID-19 and recovering from it easily, or even contracting the virus, developing antibodies, never getting sick, and sometimes never knowing that you even were exposed to it or have antibodies? But all of that is the way the seasonal flu works. And so I think we'll see the numbers are similar and the patterns are similar, but it's going to take a while because we've got to crunch this data that we're collecting. And we've seen it before in other pandemics. It takes a little while for us to say, hey, look at this. This is interesting. I mean, that's how we knew that overfat was a primary risk factor. It was clear from the data in 2009. And we didn't know that before.
Yeah, but after the fact, it was
after the fact. So we learned these things, but we can't go back and change the headlines when we see, hey, this is not happening and that is happening, but that's not what the headlines read. And they're never going to report about.
Well, they're not. The problem is they're not going to walk back the numbers. They're making money. You get money if you label it as a COVID-19 death. The hospitals make money.
Yeah, there are issues like that need to be looked at, but when the numbers are downgraded, I'll know when they're downgraded because I'll see the data in some publication. The scientists will know it; they're the ones that are going to be writing about it. But the media is not going to report it. I can guarantee it's not going to be reported.
Guarantee. I know there's going to be some big documentaries about it. I don't think I'm going to be the guy that make it. I'm going to focus on food lies, but has to be some of these big documentaries that are made exposing all this stuff. And I don't know what all the reasons were. Maybe it was just panic. I could see some of it where people just panic or politicians want to, act like they're in control or, I'm going to do the right thing. There's a million things going on. People have even crazier theories and big money and big interests and big powerful people. Whatever it is, it happened. And I think it's going to be exposed someday. And so I hope someone makes a film about it.
Well, they still talk about the grassy knoll. So,
yeah.
And did one guy shoot President Kennedy? Let's not go there. But yeah, I think there will be documentaries. There'll be articles. There are a lot of crazy ideas, no doubt about it. But unfortunately, some of them are going to be true.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I'm not a conspiracy guy at all. Although, the term red pilled, the Matrix, I got red pilled on the food stuff. So I realized I saw through the Matrix, right? You saw through the Matrix on all the food lies we've been told. And so the problem is some of our community or some people out there, they get red pilled on everything. So they think every single thing in the world is some conspiracy because we know the food has been, right? We know big food has been paying out, pharmaceutical companies paying for this. So I'm not saying there are no conspiracies out there, but I don't think everything's a conspiracy. But it's really interesting. I'm just at a loss sometimes where I'm like, I don't even know what to believe because I know that big people can be paid off and there's all these outside interests. But is it everything in our world is false or what?
Well, the big picture is important. And COVID-19 has been a serious problem. People have gotten very sick. People have died. People are losing their businesses. People are going bankrupt. That's a bigger problem. The world economy is suffering seriously. But it's sort of a snapshot. We're talking about a few months here that have gone by. When you look at food lies, we're talking about decades and even a century or more, depending on how far back you want to go to the agricultural revolution. But we're certainly talking about recent memory for all of us and ongoing food lies that get worse and worse and more, people get more tangled in these lies. That's a bigger problem. It's also a bigger problem because it's the reason so many people are vulnerable to infectious diseases.
Exactly. The misinformation, the confusion over nutrition caused the overfat pandemic.
Well, I don't know that it caused it. There was a mutation and some people got sick.
The overfat.
I'm sorry. Yes.
Yes.
It caused the overfat. Yes. The consensus that sugar and refined carbohydrate caused the overfat pandemic. As much as a small number of us have been talking about this for almost half a century, the consensus of that, the acceptance of that, is only about 5 years old. When I wrote one of those overfat papers, maybe it was the first one, I talked a lot about sugar contributing to excess body fat. And I had all these studies, and one of the reviewers said, why are you going on and on about this? Everybody knows that sugar causes overfat.
No, they don't.
And I think, wow, this is the first time ever.
That's the problem. So I want to go back. You just said about the sun. I don't think people know that the sun is okay. I think the vast, vast majority of people in the world still are afraid of the sun. It just in our little worlds, I think people are wising up to the sun thing. But just in food in general, you and I are in a little world sometimes. I think most people don't know what's going on. I'm telling you, no one knows what's going on. I interact with a lot of people because I'm making this film for the past couple of years, and nobody knows anything outside of our world.
That's because most people get their nutritional information from the news, from the media.
Yep.
And you ask them, they say, oh, you eat that many eggs a day? What's your cholesterol? I said, what do you mean? Why would you think I'd have a cholesterol problem? Oh, well, everybody knows you shouldn't eat eggs.
Yeah.
I said, where did you get that information? Oh, it's all over the news all the time.
It's insane. I can't go on another rant about this. Like, who do you think pays for the news? Who do you think pays their bills? The advertisers. The advertisers are the opposite. Someone just sent me this thing. They're a dietitian who's on our side, a smart dietitian. General Mills is sponsoring this conference, and it said part of it was about regenerative agriculture, which all sounds good. And then the last line of it was how packaged foods can contribute to a sustainable future. And I'm like, oh my God, General Mills, of course, they're saying that, of course.
Yeah. One of my favorite food stories is how agricultural scientists, and now I'm going back to the 60s or maybe 70s, agricultural scientists have removed a compound in foods that is bitter. So you're familiar with eating a plum, chewing on the skin, it's really bitter, or broccoli rabe, it's really bitter. Well, scientists discovered what that compound was. It's a phytonutrient, actually. And they were able to genetically remove it, so the future trees and plants no longer have this compound, and therefore the food is not as bitter. Well, that phytonutrient happens to be one very powerful anti-cancer compound in these foods. And the reason they did it was because people who are addicted to sugar, pretty much everybody who's overfat, their taste buds have changed and they don't tolerate bitterness.
Yeah.
And so for them to eat broccoli is something they're not going to do because it's too bitter. Broccoli rabe, they can't go near it. They can't eat plums, they can't eat peaches because the skin is too bitter because of these compounds. Well, the agricultural scientists came to the rescue. They took those compounds out, removed those anti-cancer compounds, and now these foods are not bitter anymore, so even sugar addicts can eat them.
Yeah. Unintended consequences. That's like the story of the world. It's unintended consequences. All right. We have to end this. This is super interesting talk. I hope everyone stuck around to the end. I'm going to make sure everyone sticks around to the end, and I'll put that in the intro. I'm going to end with this because some of this stuff we've been talking about COVID is a little bit, people think it's insensitive. It's like, I got pushback on social media because I posted something questioning the lockdown. And someone said, oh, well, I know someone who died, or there's this nursing home next to me and I heard of 3 ladies died there. So why are you saying this? For one, there's free speech. I can question things. I'm not, saying anything about those ladies that died. That's very sad. And it's terrible, but we're questioning things. And also, why doesn't everyone talk about the millions of people that die from preventable things like all these chronic diseases that happen because of the wrong diet information, because of the pharmaceutical and big food industries influence and all this stuff? So why can't we question that? Everyone's okay with me questioning that, but they're not okay with me questioning something else. And I just wrote, sorry, one more thing. I just wrote both my parents are gone because of this. So maybe I should be the one outraged that I can't talk about this. I can't question this.
Exactly. And, another problem is even the word prevention. Yeah, these are preventable diseases. We all know that. And sometimes people say, well, they're not really preventable because everybody gets them. Well, no, the CDC says they're preventable. The scientists say they're preventable. They are preventable. But what's happened is modern healthcare, and I won't say medicine or any one segment of healthcare, but modern healthcare has hijacked the word prevention. It no longer means we can prevent the process of cancer or the process of heart disease. What prevention now means is we can screen for cancer. So you go to the doctor says, oh, you don't have cancer. Come back next year and we'll see if you have cancer. What is the world coming to if that's what healthcare is, if that's how healthcare is being practiced?
Mm-hmm.
So we've completely eliminated the idea of prevention, which is really sad.
It's insane. A business partner, Dr. Gary, so many other good doctors have been on this podcast, including yourself, are after the true prevention, the true lifestyle interventions that promote healthy habits, behaviors, and lifestyles that can actually do the prevention. And that's what we need to focus on.
Exactly. And looking at the science, we now know that if you try and prevent all these diseases without reducing excess body fat, it isn't going to work, because the excess body fat factor is such a primary one that that is among the things that have to be done first.
It's so huge. Thank you so much for doing this. What else? Where can people find you? Any closing words?
My health and fitness website is philmaffetone.com. And for the music lovers out there, maffetonemusic.com.
Awesome. Go there. I love everything you're doing. Check out the papers. We'll link to all this stuff. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Brian.
There it is, folks. Hope you're doing well. Hope you enjoyed the show. Hope you joined the Sapien Tribe to get the extra part of this episode where we talk about herd immunity. Check out sapien.org and get our free Sapien food guide. Learn about the program. Join the tribe. Learn about everything else we're doing. Food Lies Film. We're working on that daily. Nose to tail. Get the meat delivered to you. And that's about it. Thanks for listening. Give the show a review, share with a friend, listen from the beginning, and stay happy and healthy, my friends. See ya.